Captain Traoré's Burkina Faso Fighters launch riveting surprise offensive, stirring reactions across the globe. The conflict in Burkina Faso, which has been ongoing since 2015, is a complex and multifaceted conflict with roots in both local and regional factors. Local factors. Pastoralism. The conflict is partly rooted in tensions between nomadic pastoralists and settled farmers who compete for access to land and water resources. Economic marginalization. The northern part of Burkina Faso is one of the poorest regions in the country, and the people living there have long felt marginalized by the central government. Weak governance. The government of Burkina Faso has been criticized for its corruption and its failure to provide basic services, such as education and healthcare, to the people in the north. Regional factors. The spread of jihadist groups. In recent years, jihadist groups from neighboring Mali and Niger have been expanding their operations into Burkina Faso. These groups have exploited the country's weak governance and lack of security to gain a foothold and recruit new members. The Sahel crisis. The conflict in Burkina Faso is part of a wider crisis that is affecting the entire Sahel region, which stretches from Senegal to Sudan. The Sahel is a vast and arid region that is home to many different ethnic groups and cultures. The region is also struggling with poverty, climate change, and the effects of terrorism. The evolution of the conflict. The conflict in Burkina Faso has evolved over time. In the early years, the violence was largely focused on attacks against security forces and civilians in the northern part of the country. However, in recent years, the conflict has spread to other parts of the country, and the number of attacks has increased dramatically. The rebels have also become more sophisticated in their tactics, and they are now using IEDs, improvised explosive devices, suicide bombers, and other forms of violence. The impact of the conflict. The conflict in Burkina Faso has had a devastating impact on the country. More than 2 million people have been displaced from their homes, and thousands more have been killed or injured. The conflict has also hampered economic development, and it has contributed to food insecurity and malnutrition. The international response. The international community has responded to the conflict in Burkina Faso by providing humanitarian aid and by training and equipping the country's security forces. However, the international community has been criticized for not doing enough to address the root causes of the conflict. Looking to the future. The future of Burkina Faso is uncertain. The conflict is likely to continue for some time, and it is unclear whether the government will be able to regain control of the situation. The international community will need to continue to provide support to Burkina Faso, and it will also need to find ways to address the underlying causes of the conflict. Captain Ibrahim Traore is a young and charismatic military officer who has emerged as a leading figure in the conflict in Burkina Faso. He is the leader of a group of fighters who have been fighting against the government for several years. Traore is a highly respected figure among his men, and he is known for his bravery and military prowess. He is also a skilled tactician, and he has been able to outmaneuver the government's forces on several occasions. Traore's fighters are a diverse group of men from all over Burkina Faso. They are united by a common desire to overthrow the government and establish a new order in the country. Traore's fighters are well-armed and well-trained, and they have access to a network of allies in neighboring countries. Traore's surprise offensive has sent shockwaves through Burkina Faso and the international community. The attack was audacious and well executed, and it has demonstrated Traore's ability to mount a serious challenge to the government. The attack has also raised fears that the conflict in Burkina Faso could escalate further. Traore's fighters are a formidable force, and they are likely to continue to pose a serious threat to the government. The international community will need to carefully monitor the situation in Burkina Faso and consider how to respond to Traore's challenge. The surprise offensive launched by Captain Traoré's Burkina Faso fighters was a major shock to the government and the international community. The attack was well planned and well executed, and it caught the government's forces off guard. The government's forces were unable to mount a strong defense, and they were quickly overwhelmed by Traoré's fighters. The surprise nature of the offensive was due in part to Traoré's ability to maintain secrecy. He was able to gather his forces and plan the attack without the government's knowledge. He also used innovative tactics, such as attacking from multiple directions simultaneously, which further caught the government's forces off guard. The surprise offensive has had a major impact on the conflict in Burkina Faso. It has demonstrated the growing strength of the rebel movement, and it has raised fears that the conflict could escalate further. The government has been forced to reevaluate its strategy, and it is now facing a serious challenge from Traoré's fighters. The international community has also been caught off guard by the offensive. It is now considering how to respond to the growing threat posed by Traoré's fighters. The international community will need to work with the government of Burkina Faso to find a solution to the conflict. The surprise offensive by Captain Traoré's fighters was a major turning point in the conflict in Burkina Faso. The attack has changed the course of the conflict, and it will have a lasting impact on the country. The conflict in Burkina Faso has its roots in a series of factors that have been brewing for decades. The current insurgency, which began in 2015, is a complex and multifaceted issue with a long history of underlying causes. Historical roots of the conflict. The history of Burkina Faso is marked by periods of instability and conflict. The country was formerly known as Upper Volta and experienced several coups d'état and periods of military rule throughout the 20th century. In 1987, Blaise Compaoré seized power in a coup and ruled for 27 years. During Compaoré's rule, he suppressed political dissent and marginalized ethnic groups in the northern and eastern parts of the country. This marginalization fueled resentment and contributed to the rise of armed groups in the region. Emergence of armed groups. In the early 2000s, armed groups began to emerge in northern Burkina Faso, primarily composed of young men who had been marginalized by the government. These groups were initially focused on self-defense and protection of their communities, but they gradually became more radicalized and engaged in attacks against government forces and civilians. The Sahel crisis and the spread of jihadist groups. In recent years, the conflict in Burkina Faso has become increasingly intertwined with the Sahel crisis, a broader regional instability that has been driven by factors such as poverty, climate change, and the rise of jihadist groups. Jihadist groups, such as Ansar al-Islam and the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, ISGS, have exploited the instability in Burkina Faso and neighboring countries to expand their operations. These groups have gained a foothold in rural areas, where they have recruited new members and established a network of bases. The rise of Captain Traoré and his fighters. Captain Ibrahim Traoré emerged as a prominent figure in the conflict in Burkina Faso in 2015. Traoré, a former military officer, formed his own group of fighters and began conducting attacks against government forces and civilians. Traoré's group has grown in strength and sophistication over the years. They are now well-armed and well-trained, and they have a network of allies in neighboring countries. The surprise offensive and its impact. In January 2024, Traoré's fighters launched a surprise offensive against the government. The attack caught the government's forces off guard and resulted in the capture of several key towns and military bases. The surprise offensive sent shockwaves through Burkina Faso and the international community. It demonstrated the growing strength of the rebel movement and raised fears that the conflict could escalate further. The government has been forced to reevaluate its strategy and has launched a counteroffensive against Traoré's fighters. However, the conflict has continued to escalate, and there is no clear end in sight. The future of the conflict. The future of the conflict in Burkina Faso is uncertain. The conflict is likely to continue for some time, and it is unclear whether the government will be able to regain control of the situation. The international community will need to continue to provide support to Burkina Faso, and it will also need to find ways to address the underlying causes of the conflict. These include addressing issues such as poverty, marginalization, and the spread of jihadist ideology. Captain Ibrahim Traoré is a key figure in the ongoing conflict in Burkina Faso, having emerged as a prominent leader of the rebel movement. Traoré's rise to prominence can be attributed to a combination of factors, including his military background, his charismatic leadership, and the grievances held by his supporters. Military background and strategic acumen. Traoré's military background has played a significant role in his success as a rebel leader. He is a former artillery officer with experience in combat and strategic planning. This expertise has enabled him to organize and lead his fighters effectively, develop effective tactics, and outmaneuver government forces. Charismatic leadership and appeal to disenfranchised youth. Traoré has also emerged as a charismatic leader who has attracted a following among Burkina Faso's youth, particularly those who feel marginalized and disillusioned by the government. His ability to connect with these young people and articulate their grievances has helped to fuel the rebellion. Grievances and support for the rebel movement. The grievances held by Traoré and his supporters stem from a range of factors, including Economic marginalization. The northern and eastern regions of Burkina Faso, where Traoré's support base is concentrated, are among the poorest in the country. These areas have been neglected by the government, leading to high levels of poverty and unemployment. Weak governance and corruption. The government of Burkina Faso has been criticized for its corruption, inefficiency, and lack of accountability. This has contributed to a sense of disenfranchisement and anger among many Burkinabés. Growing influence of jihadist groups. The spread of jihadist groups in Burkina Faso and neighboring countries has further fueled the rebellion. These groups have exploited the grievances of marginalized communities and offer a sense of purpose and belonging to young people who feel lost and without hope. Traoré and his group have capitalized on these grievances to gain support and legitimacy among the Burkinabe population. Their promises of improved governance, economic development, and security have resonated with many who feel that the government has failed them. The role of external support. While Traoré and his group have gained significant support within Burkina Faso, they have also received external support from neighboring countries and some international actors. This support has provided them with weapons, training, and logistical assistance, enabling them to expand their operations and pose a serious challenge to the government. The future of Captain Traoré and his group. The future of Captain Traoré and his group remains uncertain. The conflict in Burkina Faso is complex and multifaceted, and there is no easy solution. Traoré and his rebels are likely to continue to pose a serious challenge to the government, and the conflict could escalate further if the underlying grievances are not addressed. The international community will need to play a role in mediating the conflict and supporting efforts to address the root causes of the instability. Only through a comprehensive approach that addresses poverty, governance, and the spread of extremism can there be a lasting peace in Burkina Faso. The grievances held by the rebels in Burkina Faso are complex and multifaceted. However, some of the most common grievances include economic marginalization. The northern and eastern regions of Burkina Faso, where the rebels are strongest, are among the poorest in the country. These areas have been neglected by the government, leading to high levels of poverty and unemployment. Weak governance and corruption. The government of Burkina Faso has been criticized for its corruption, inefficiency, and lack of accountability. This has contributed to a sense of disenfranchisement and anger among many Burkinabés. Insecurity. The country has been plagued by violence and insecurity for many years, which has made it difficult for people to live normal lives. The rebels often target government officials, civilians, and security forces. Pastoralism and land disputes. There is a long-standing conflict between nomadic pastoralists and settled farmers over access to land and water resources. This conflict has been exacerbated by climate change, which has made it more difficult for people to find resources. The spread of jihadist groups. In recent years, jihadist groups from neighboring countries have been expanding their operations into Burkina Faso. These groups have exploited the grievances of marginalized communities and offer a sense of purpose and belonging to young people who feel lost and without hope. These grievances have created a fertile ground for the rebellion to take root. The rebels have capitalized on the anger and frustration of the population, and they have promised to improve governance, security, and economic conditions. The government has been slow to address these grievances, and this has only fueled the rebellion. The international community has also played a role in the conflict, providing support to both the government and the rebels. This has made it difficult to find a lasting solution to the conflict. The future of Burkina Faso is uncertain. The conflict is likely to continue for some time, and there is no clear end in sight. The international community will need to play a role in mediating the conflict and supporting efforts to address the root causes of the instability. The surprise offensive launched by Captain Traoré's Burkina Faso Fighters on January 4, 2024 was audacious and well executed. The attack caught the government's forces off guard and resulted in the capture of several key towns and military bases. The offensive began at 4 a.m. local time with a series of coordinated attacks on government positions across Burkina Faso. Traoré's fighters used a variety of tactics, including surprise attacks, ambushes, and coordinated assaults on multiple targets. They also used a mix of light and heavy weapons, including machine guns, rocket-propelled grenades, and mortars. The government's forces were caught off guard by the scale and ferocity of the attack. They were unable to mount a strong defense, and they were quickly overwhelmed by Traoré's fighters. By the end of the day, Traoré's fighters had captured several key towns, including Djibo, Dori, and Kaya. They also captured several military bases and seized large quantities of weapons and ammunition. The aftermath. The surprise offensive sent shockwaves through Burkina Faso and the international community. It demonstrated the growing strength of the rebel movement and raised fears that the conflict could escalate further. The government was forced to reevaluate its strategy and has launched a counteroffensive against Traoré's fighters. However, the conflict has continued to escalate, and there is no clear end in sight. The impact. The surprise offensive has had a significant impact on the conflict in Burkina Faso. It has increased the level of violence and instability in the country, and it has made it more difficult for the government to regain control of the situation. The offensive has also raised concerns about the potential for the conflict to spill over into neighboring countries. The international community has condemned the offensive and called for a ceasefire. However, it is unclear whether the parties to the conflict are willing to negotiate a peace settlement. The future of Burkina Faso is uncertain. The conflict is likely to continue for some time, and it is unclear whether the government will be able to regain control of the situation. The international community will need to carefully monitor the situation in Burkina Faso and consider how to respond to the challenge posed by Traoré's fighters. Captain Traoré's Burkina Faso fighters employed a variety of effective tactics to achieve their objectives during the surprise offensive. These tactics included surprise attacks. The rebels capitalized on the element of surprise to catch government forces off guard and gain an initial advantage. They launched coordinated attacks at dawn or dusk, when visibility was limited, and they used deception and ambushes to further disorient their opponents. Mobility and adaptability. The rebels demonstrated their mobility and adaptability by conducting rapid maneuvers and shifting their tactics based on the situation. They utilized motorcycles, off-road vehicles, and small arms to traverse the rugged terrain and strike at vulnerable government positions. Use of light and heavy weapons. The rebels employed a mix of light and heavy weapons to inflict maximum damage on government forces. They used machine guns, rocket-propelled grenades, mortars, and improvised explosive devices, IEDs, to overwhelm their opponents and seize control of key locations. Coordinated assaults on multiple targets. The rebels coordinated their attacks across multiple targets simultaneously, stretching government forces thin and preventing them from effectively responding. This tactic disrupted the government's command and control structure and contributed to its early setbacks. Exploitation of local knowledge. The rebels drew on their deep knowledge of the local terrain and population to their advantage. They used local guides and informants to navigate the region undetected, and they exploited local grievances and resentment towards the government to gain support from the populace. Infiltration and intelligence gathering. The rebels infiltrated government positions and gathered intelligence to plan their attacks. They used informants, spies, and captured equipment to gain valuable insights into the government's troop movements, vulnerabilities, and logistical weaknesses. Exploitation of government weaknesses. The rebels exploited the government's weaknesses, including poor communication, coordination, and intelligence gathering. They targeted communication infrastructure, disrupted supply lines, and intimidated government officials to sow confusion and demoralization. Strategic retreats and ambushes. When faced with superior government forces, the rebels employed strategic retreats to draw them into ambushes. They used hit-and-run tactics to inflict casualties and damage government equipment, while maintaining their mobility and avoiding direct confrontations. Use of improvised weapons and explosives. The rebels demonstrated ingenuity in their use of improvised weapons and explosives. They constructed IEDs using readily available materials, such as fertilizer and scrap metal, and they used these devices to target government convoys and bases. Exploitation of civilian support. The rebels cultivated support among the local population by providing protection, services, and economic opportunities. They distributed food, medicine, and other aid, and they offered employment opportunities to marginalized youth. This support network provided the rebels with valuable intelligence, resources, and a sense of legitimacy. These tactics, employed in combination, enabled Captain Traoré's Burkina Faso fighters to achieve their objectives during the surprise offensive. They demonstrated a high degree of planning, coordination, and adaptability, and they effectively exploited the government's weaknesses. The full extent of the damage inflicted and casualties sustained during the surprise offensive by Captain Traoré's Burkina Faso fighters is still being assessed. However, there is no doubt that the attack was a major blow to the government and had a significant impact on the country. Government losses. The government has confirmed that several key towns and military bases were captured by the rebels, and that large quantities of weapons and ammunition were seized. The government has also acknowledged that its forces suffered significant casualties, including both military personnel and civilians. However, the government has not released any specific figures on the number of casualties. Rebel losses. The rebels have not released any information on their own casualties. However, it is likely that they also suffered significant losses, given the scale of the fighting. The rebels have a history of taking heavy casualties, and they are often willing to sacrifice their own fighters in order to achieve their objectives. Civilian impact. The offensive has had a devastating impact on the civilian population in Burkina Faso. The fighting has displaced thousands of people from their homes, and many have been caught in the crossfire. There have also been reports of looting and other crimes committed by both sides. International response. The international community has condemned the offensive and called for a ceasefire. The United Nations Security Council has demanded that the rebels immediately withdraw from the captured towns and bases. The African Union has also called for an end to the violence and has deployed a mediation team to Burkina Faso. Future of the conflict. It is unclear how the conflict in Burkina Faso will develop in the coming months. The government has launched a counteroffensive against the rebels, but it is unclear whether it will be able to retake the captured towns and bases. The rebels have vowed to continue fighting until they achieve their goals, which include overthrowing the government and establishing a new order in the country. The conflict in Burkina Faso is a complex and multifaceted issue, and there is no easy solution. The international community will need to remain engaged and work with the government and the rebels to find a peaceful resolution to the conflict. The surprise offensive launched by Captain Traoré's Burkina Faso Fighters on January 4, 2024, has been met with a range of reactions from the government and the international community. Government response. The government of Burkina Faso has been caught off guard by the offensive and has been struggling to regain control of the situation. The government has launched a counteroffensive against the rebels, but it has been met with mixed success. The government has also called for a ceasefire, but the rebels have refused. In a televised address, President Traoré condemned the offensive and called on the rebels to lay down their arms. He also announced that the government would be taking steps to address the grievances of the rebels, including improving governance, security, and economic conditions. However, the government's response to the offensive has been criticized by some for being slow and ineffective. The government has been criticized for failing to anticipate the attack and for taking too long to launch a counteroffensive. There have also been reports of human rights abuses by government forces. International community response. The international community has also condemned the offensive and called for a ceasefire. The United Nations Security Council has demanded that the rebels immediately withdraw from the captured towns and bases. The African Union has also called for an end to the violence and has deployed a mediation team to Burkina Faso. The European Union has expressed its support for the government of Burkina Faso and has called on the rebels to engage in dialogue. The United States has also condemned the offensive and has called for a peaceful resolution to the conflict. However, the international community's response to the offensive has been limited by the lack of consensus on how to address the situation. There is no clear consensus on whether the international community should intervene militarily in Burkina Faso, and there is also concern that any intervention could backfire and further destabilize the country. Overall reaction. The surprise offensive by Captain Traoré's Burkina Faso Fighters has been a major setback for the government and has raised concerns about the future of the country. The international community is now considering its next steps, but it is unclear what role it will play in resolving the conflict. Captain Traoré's Burkina Faso Fighters are driven by a complex mix of grievances and aspirations. These motivations and goals have evolved over time and are shaped by the specific context of the conflict in Burkina Faso. Economic marginalization and disenfranchisement. A key motivation for the rebellion is economic marginalization and disenfranchisement of the northern and eastern regions of Burkina Faso. These regions, where Traoré's support base is concentrated, are among the poorest in the country. They have been neglected by the government, leading to high levels of poverty, unemployment, and lack of access to basic services. This has created a sense of anger and frustration among the population, which has been exploited by the rebels. Weak governance and corruption. Another major grievance fueling the rebellion is weak governance and corruption. The government of Burkina Faso has been criticized for its mismanagement of resources, lack of transparency, and corruption. This has eroded public trust in the government and led to a perception that the system is rigged in favor of the elite. Insecurity and violence. The country has also been plagued by violence and insecurity for many years. The rebels often target government officials, civilians, and security forces. This violence has created a climate of fear and uncertainty, and it has made it difficult for people to live normal lives. Pastoralism and land disputes. There is a long-standing conflict between nomadic pastoralists and settled farmers over access to land and water resources. This conflict has been exacerbated by climate change, which has made it more difficult for people to find resources. The spread of jihadist groups. In recent years, jihadist groups from neighboring countries have been expanding their operations into Burkina Faso. These groups have exploited the grievances of marginalized communities and offer a sense of purpose and belonging to young people who feel lost and without hope. Goals of the rebels. The rebels' goals are to overthrow the government and establish a new order in the country. They promise to improve governance, security, and economic conditions. They also seek to address the grievances of marginalized communities and promote social justice. The future of the conflict. The conflict in Burkina Faso is likely to continue for some time, and it is unclear whether the rebels will achieve their goals. The government has been slow to address the grievances of the rebels, and this has only fueled the rebellion. The international community has also played a role in the conflict, providing support to both the government and the rebels. This has made it difficult to find a lasting solution to the conflict. The future of Burkina Faso is uncertain. The conflict is likely to continue for some time, and it is unclear whether the government will be able to regain control of the situation. The international community will need to play a role in mediating the conflict and supporting efforts to address the root causes of the instability. The motivations and goals of the rebels in Burkina Faso are complex and multifaceted. They are driven by a combination of economic marginalization, weak governance, insecurity, land disputes, and the spread of jihadist groups. The rebels' goals are to overthrow the government and establish a new order in the country. The future of the conflict is uncertain, and it is unclear whether the rebels will achieve their goals. Captain Traoré's surprise offensive on Burkina Faso was a significant and well-executed operation that achieved several of its primary objectives. The rebels were able to capture several key towns and military bases, seize large quantities of weapons and ammunition, and inflict significant casualties on government forces. The offensive also sent shockwaves through the government and the international community, and it raised concerns about the future of the country. Objectives achieved. The surprise offensive achieved several key objectives for the rebels. 1. Capture of key towns and bases. The rebels were able to capture several important towns and military bases, including Djibo, Dori, and Kaya. These captures gave them a significant foothold in the north and east of the country, and they also provided them with a strategic advantage in the ongoing conflict. 2. Seizure of weapons and ammunition. The rebels seized large quantities of weapons and ammunition from government forces during the offensive. This included machine guns, rocket-propelled grenades, mortars, and improvised explosive devices, IEDs. The acquisition of these weapons significantly enhanced the rebels' firepower and their ability to wage war. 3. Inflicting casualties on government forces. The offensive inflicted significant casualties on government forces, both military personnel and civilians. This caused the government to lose morale and confidence in its ability to defend the country. 4. Sending a message of strength. The surprise offensive sent a strong message to the government and the international community that the rebels were a force to be reckoned with. It demonstrated their ability to execute audacious operations and achieve their objectives. 5. Raising concerns about the future of the country. The offensive raised concerns about the future of Burkina Faso and the stability of the region. It highlighted the deep-seated grievances that exist in the country and the potential for the conflict to escalate further. Overall effectiveness. The surprise offensive was a significant and effective operation that achieved several of its primary objectives. It demonstrated the rebels' military capabilities and their ability to challenge the government's authority. The offensive also had a major impact on the country's political and security situation, raising concerns about the future of Burkina Faso. Limitations and future outlook. Despite its successes, the offensive had some limitations. The rebels were unable to maintain control of all the towns and bases they captured, and they suffered some casualties themselves. The government was able to regroup and launch a counteroffensive, and the conflict is likely to continue in the coming months and years. The future of the conflict in Burkina Faso is uncertain. The rebels have shown that they are a capable and resilient force, but they will need to continue to adapt and innovate to overcome the government's superior resources. The international community will also need to play a role in mediating the conflict and supporting efforts to address the root causes of the instability. The surprise offensive launched by Captain Traoré's Burkina Faso Fighters on January 4, 2024, has had a significant and destabilizing impact on Burkina Faso and the wider region. Impact on Burkina Faso. The offensive has had a profound impact on Burkina Faso, both in terms of its security situation and its political stability. The rebels' capture of several key towns and military bases has further weakened the government's authority and control over the country. The conflict has also displaced thousands of people and caused widespread damage to infrastructure. In addition, the offensive has raised concerns about the potential for the conflict to escalate further and to spill over into neighboring countries. The Sahel region is already home to several other armed groups, and there is a risk that the Burkina Faso conflict could provide them with more recruits and resources. Impact on the wider region. The surprise offensive has also had a ripple effect across the wider Sahel region. Neighboring countries, such as Mali and Niger, are on high alert for potential spillover effects, and they have taken steps to bolster their security forces. The international community is also concerned about the potential impact of the conflict on regional security, and it has called for a ceasefire and a negotiated settlement. Long-term implications. The long-term implications of the surprise offensive are still unfolding. The conflict is likely to continue for some time, and it could have a lasting impact on Burkina Faso's political, economic, and social development. The international community will need to continue to engage in efforts to mediate the conflict and support peace-building efforts. Here are some of the potential long-term implications of the surprise offensive. Further destabilization of Burkina Faso and the wider region. The conflict could further destabilize Burkina Faso and the wider Sahel region, leading to increased violence, displacement, and humanitarian needs. Escalation of the conflict. The conflict could escalate further, with the rebels gaining more ground or the government responding with greater force. This could lead to a protracted and bloody conflict. Intervention by the international community. The international community may be compelled to intervene in the conflict to prevent further escalation or to protect civilians. This could involve military intervention, peacekeeping missions, or humanitarian assistance. Long-term damage to Burkina Faso's development. The conflict could have a devastating impact on Burkina Faso's development, deterring investment, disrupting economic activity, and undermining public services. Regional arms race. The conflict could lead to a regional arms race as neighboring countries seek to strengthen their militaries to defend against potential threats. The surprise offensive has highlighted the complex and interconnected nature of the security challenges facing the Sahel region. The international community will need to work closely with regional partners to address these challenges and promote peace and stability. The surprise offensive launched by Captain Traoré's Burkina Faso Fighters on January 4, 2024, has raised concerns among Western governments and their interests in the region. Security concerns. Western governments are concerned about the potential for the conflict in Burkina Faso to escalate further and destabilize the wider Sahel region. This could lead to increased violence, displacement, and humanitarian needs, as well as provide opportunities for terrorist groups to operate and expand their reach. Economic interests. Western governments also have economic interests in the Sahel region, as it is a major source of natural resources such as gold, uranium, and oil. The instability in Burkina Faso could disrupt these industries and damage the region's economy. Counterterrorism priorities. The Sahel region is a major battleground for the fight against terrorism, and the Burkina Faso conflict could further complicate these efforts. The rebels may be linked to or inspired by terrorist groups, and the conflict could provide them with more recruits and resources. Response options. Western governments are considering a range of options in response to the Burkina Faso conflict. These include supporting the Burkina Faso government. Western governments could provide the government with military training, equipment, and financial assistance to help it combat the rebels. Disrupting arms trafficking. Western governments could work to disrupt the flow of weapons to the rebels by working with regional partners and using sanctions. Boosting counterterrorism cooperation. Western governments could enhance their counterterrorism cooperation with regional partners to prevent the Burkina Faso conflict from fueling terrorism. Providing humanitarian assistance, Western governments could provide humanitarian assistance to the millions of people displaced by the conflict. The response of Western governments will need to be carefully calibrated to address the complex security, economic, and counterterrorism challenges posed by the Burkina Faso conflict. The surprise offensive launched by Captain Traoré's Burkina Faso Fighters on January 4, 2024, has had a profound and uncertain impact on the future of Burkina Faso. Political stability. The offensive has further weakened the government's authority and control over the country. The rebels' capture of several key towns and military bases has demonstrated their military capabilities and their ability to challenge the government's legitimacy. This has led to a sense of insecurity and uncertainty among the population, and it has cast doubt on the government's ability to govern effectively. Economic development. The conflict has had a devastating impact on Burkina Faso's economy. The displacement of people and the destruction of infrastructure have disrupted economic activity and driven up prices. Investors are hesitant to invest in the country, and tourism has declined significantly. Social cohesion. The conflict has exacerbated existing social divisions in Burkina Faso. The rebels have drawn support from marginalized communities who feel that they have been neglected by the government. This has led to clashes between the rebels and government forces, as well as between different ethnic groups. International relations. The offensive has damaged Burkina Faso's reputation internationally. The government has been criticized for its handling of the conflict, and the country has been downgraded by international financial institutions. This could make it difficult for Burkina Faso to secure loans and aid in the future. The future of Burkina Faso. The future of Burkina Faso is uncertain. The conflict is likely to continue for some time, and it could have a lasting impact on the country's political, economic, and social development. The international community will need to continue to engage in efforts to mediate the conflict and support peace-building efforts. Here are some of the potential scenarios for the future of Burkina Faso. The government could regain control of the country and restore stability. However, this would require a significant change in the government's approach to governance and security. The conflict could escalate further, leading to a protracted and bloody civil war. This would have a devastating impact on the country and could destabilize the wider region. The rebels could overthrow the government and establish a new regime. This would likely lead to further instability and human rights abuses. The international community will need to carefully consider these scenarios and develop a comprehensive strategy to address the challenges facing Burkina Faso. This strategy should include support for the government, mediation efforts, and humanitarian assistance. Preventing similar attacks in Burkina Faso requires a comprehensive approach that addresses the root causes of the conflict, strengthens security forces, and promotes inclusive governance. Here are some recommendations for preventing similar attacks in the future. 1. Address the root causes of the conflict. The surprise offensive was fueled by a complex mix of grievances, including economic marginalization, weak governance, insecurity, and the spread of jihadist groups. Addressing these root causes is essential to preventing future conflicts. The government should focus on improving governance, addressing economic inequality, and promoting social cohesion. 2. Strengthen security forces. Government forces were caught off guard by the offensive, demonstrating their lack of preparedness. The government should invest in training and equipment for security forces, and it should develop a more effective intelligence gathering and surveillance network. 3. Promote inclusive governance. The government should reach out to marginalized communities and address their grievances. It should also ensure that all citizens have a voice in decision-making processes. Inclusive governance can help to reduce resentment and prevent the rise of armed groups. 4. Support mediation efforts. The international community should continue to support mediation efforts in Burkina Faso. Mediation can help to create a framework for dialogue and negotiation between the government and the rebels. 5. Provide humanitarian assistance. The conflict has displaced millions of people and caused widespread suffering. The international community should provide humanitarian assistance to those affected by the conflict. 6. Disrupt arms trafficking. Arms trafficking is fueling the conflict in Burkina Faso. The international community should work to disrupt the flow of weapons to the rebels. 7. Enhance counterterrorism cooperation. The Sahel region is a major battleground for the fight against terrorism. The international community should enhance counterterrorism cooperation with regional partners to prevent the Burkina Faso conflict from fueling terrorism. 8. Support peacebuilding efforts. Once the conflict is over, the international community should support peacebuilding efforts in Burkina Faso. This includes helping to rebuild infrastructure, promote reconciliation, and support economic development. By addressing the root causes of the conflict, strengthening security forces, promoting inclusive governance, and supporting mediation efforts, the international community can help to prevent similar attacks in Burkina Faso and the wider region. The surprise offensive launched by Captain Traoré's Burkina Faso Fighters on January 4, 2024, was a significant and destabilizing event that has had a profound impact on Burkina Faso and the wider region. The conflict has highlighted the complex and interconnected nature of the security challenges facing the Sahel region. The international community will need to work closely with regional partners to address these challenges and promote peace and stability. Key questions. What are the root causes of the conflict in Burkina Faso? What are the implications of the offensive for the future of Burkina Faso? What can be done to prevent similar attacks in the future? Call to action. The international community should continue to engage in efforts to mediate the conflict and support peacebuilding efforts in Burkina Faso. By addressing the root causes of the conflict, strengthening security forces, and promoting inclusive governance, the international community can help to prevent similar attacks in Burkina Faso and the wider region. Remember, we're all part of this journey together. Let's keep exploring, learning, and growing. Until next time, stay curious and keep spreading those positive vibes. Thanks for joining in. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to hit that like button, drop a comment, and hit subscribe to stay tuned for more exciting content coming your way.